The block length isn't critical, but it does need to be enough to cover the divider, the slow air hole, and far enough back to give a good seal behind it. You don't want it so long that it's going to interfere with putting your mouth at the end of this. You don't put your mouth over the end, but you don't want it running into your lips. So I'm going to cut this off about here. You can always make it shorter later. Alright. There's some details here, so let's go ahead and move you closer up. Okay, so the job of the block is to move, like I said, air across the sound hole. The way it is now, it's got an arch shape. I'd like that to be flat. Let's see if it makes a note the way it is now, though. Okay, not bad. Surprising, actually, that it makes a note the first try. But I do want to refine that edge. So ideally, I will end up with a block that looks more like this. Doesn't have to be this thin, but it does have a rectangular slot cross section. And how do I produce that? Well, first, I'm going to sand it down. I want this end, one end to be flat to match that. So I'm going to sand it. I'm going to push down more at one end than the other. Trying not to sand my fingers. I'm looking for that kind of a shape at the back, maybe a little more. A little more. Oops. Alright, good enough. And it's going to end up splintering on these edges if I'm not careful, so I'm going to just remove a little bit of that now to prevent it from splitting all the way up the edge. I don't want to shape this anyway for aesthetics. You can see that piece that would peel all the way up if I pulled on it. Probably not critical, but you never know where those things are going to run. So now I've got a little bit better of a notch there, but I want to make that rectangular instead of arched so it matches, puts a uniform flow across the sound edge. And how do I do that? Well, I don't want to remove material in the middle. I do want to remove it out here on the sides. I also want it to be the same width as my sound hole and slow air hole. So I'm going to use them as a guide. Use the sound hole as a guide to mark where I have to remove material. Now, what I don't want also is air path that is significantly tapered. So I'm going to try to make this pretty parallel. The inside is pretty soft, it's almost foam-like. The outside is quite hard after it dries. So I'm not worried too much about cutting all the way through. But I do want to avoid cutting too deep, so I'll finish that, and then I'll cut flat across to get my rectangle shape. Not too deep, hopefully. If I mess this up, I cut a new one. Okay, you can start to see how I'm sort of developing a rectangular shape. Need to get some more off this side. Did I mention don't cut your fingers? Way too easy to do with a sharp knife. And the X-Acto is a little pointier than I'd like, so I'm going to switch to my little pocket knife. It's getting better. A little uneven in height, but that's okay, because I'm going to fix that with sanding. You can see what I've got now. Definitely taller than I'd like. I'd like that to be maybe 2/3 or even half of that thickness of the slot. It's about the right width. Let's see how it sounds. Quite airy, and it's almost certainly because that slot is too tall. So I fix that by sanding it down. Kind of managing the pressures to get it on various edges, to get it to sand in the direction that you want it to, remove material where you want, and end up with, hopefully, a uniform thickness, uniform height slot for that air to travel nicely through. Alright, and I'm also going to use my sanding stick to clean that up a little bit, because these ragged edges here will definitely disturb the flow of air and make it not sound as nice. Alright, let's try that. If you blow hard, it's going to make a higher pitch. It's going to skip up on harmonic. And the position of this makes a big difference. So if this is covering over the hole too much, or if the hole's too narrow, it will tend to squeak. It'd be very difficult to play the low notes. If it's too far back, well, you won't get any flow over the sound hole at all. If it's kind of intermediate, too far back, it's very airy, or it won't make a sound. So ideally, this edge of the sound hole and the edge of the block will line up, but you can adjust forward and back a little bit to get it to play right, even after you're done with the flute. Alright, that's a pretty decent sound. The larger flutes tend to sound a little more airy. I'm just going to square up that edge a bit. Make sure it's nice and sharp. The edges are kind of overhanging there, so I'm going to shape the block just a little more on the outside. This part has nothing to do with the sound, just aesthetics. And I'm going to shape the back edge just a little bit more too. sandpaper. And like I did with the sound hole earlier, there's a little whisker of a fiber there. Let's get that out of there. Like I did with the sound hole, I also like to reinforce these with a bit of super glue, because otherwise they will absorb moisture, more likely to get damaged if you take them off. This just makes them a little more durable. Actually gets some soaked into the edge. This will make it rough temporarily just from that super glue setting, so it'll need to be sanded again as soon as it sets up. Try not to glue your block to your finger, which is why I'm going to use a bit of the accelerant again. And now it's just a little bit rough, so I'm going to sand it again. I'm going to sand it with this. If you want to get, if you have just paper and you want to get it into a rectangular spot, pinch it a bit like that. And I put super glue down here, not up there before, so I could still hold it without completely gluing it to my fingers. So I'm going to put a little more around there this time, just to finish reinforcing it. Making sure I get it in the end grain here. Go by feel. It's very easy to feel rough spots, much easier than to see them. Alright. And how do we attach that? Well, we're not going to glue it on because we want to be able to adjust it. Sometimes you need to be able to adjust it just based on humidity and temperature in the day. But I'm going to, so instead of attaching it permanently, I'm going to bind it on. You can do this with, this is just deerskin lace. Doesn't really matter what width it is. You can do it with string, you can do it with rubber bands. If you do a rubber band, just be careful not to leave it on or make it too tight because it will crush it over time. Or you can even use strips of polar fleece. It functions very much like the leather. It has enough friction when you tie it into the block that it does a good job of holding it in place. Don't run to your closet and cut up your sweatshirts though. Unless you're really desperate. Doesn't really matter how far around this goes as long as it holds it flat. If you made a good surface, you only really need to get a few wraps. I could go around another time, but I like the look of a longer lace hanging down. Doesn't have to be really tight, just has to be snug enough to hold it in place and keep a good seal. And it's because of the surface of the leather, just a half knot will hold it just fine. You do want to be able to take this off later and adjust it if you have to, or replace the block if you have to. Alright, and in the next video I'm going to show you how to tune it. Put the finger holes in and make it play notes.